Resident Evil 4 is often classed as the best game in the entire series, and it is also often cited as one of the best games of all time. I have lost track of the countless people and reviewers that have praised the game as a timeless classic, and it is very easy for those that have never played the game to consider this media hyperbole and over-enthusiastic fans with rose-tinted glasses. And though there may be a little bit of truth there, as someone who has played the game countless times, I've lost track, but if I had to give an educated guess, I'd say I've played the game through no less than 25 times. I can safely say that this game deserves every ounce of praise it receives. Of course, as a fan of the series, my opinion is biased, but nonetheless, Resident Evil 4 is an incredible experience for many reasons. In this essay, I will attempt to cover and explain as directly as possible why this game is so good. Before we talk about Resident Evil 4 itself, we must first understand some history about Resident Evil as a series. The game was, after all, the fourth installment in the series, and not a standalone game, although you would be forgiven for thinking so. Resident Evil was born in 1996 with the release of the original survival horror classic on the PlayStation. Resident Evil 4 was released in 2005, a whole 9 years into the series' lifespan, which for most video game series is a long time. In those 9 years, the series had established itself as a survival horror, a genre that has a strong emphasis on puzzle solving, inventory management, and slow-paced environmental storytelling. Resident Evil games themselves borrowed heavily from B-movies, in particular those by George R. Romero.
No! Don't go!
However, after nearly a decade of the same mechanics, the gaming landscape had changed, and consumers were rejecting survival horror titles in favor of more fast-paced shooting games. Sales of Resident Evil gradually declined, and reviews, which had previously praised the series, were beginning to turn cold. The series had grown predictable, tired, and formulaic. Capcom thus had two options: end the series or reinvent it. They infamously chose the latter. Shinji Mikami, the creator of Resident Evil, had also grown bored of making survival horror games, and was more than happy to spice up the series with the fourth entry. The developers went through numerous iterations of Resident Evil 4, all of which drastically differed from the last. One early version of the game was so drastically different that it was decided that it should become its own series instead, Devil May Cry. Another version, dubbed the Hookman version by fans, involved the protagonist, Leon, exploring a creepy castle infected with the progenitor virus, and fighting living dolls and a ghostly apparition wielding a hook. Although this version looked terrifying, it was again believed to be too different to what Resident Evil was as a series, and was scrapped. However, despite efforts to keep the game linked to its predecessors, those links proved to be only tangential. The final result looked and played drastically different to previous entries in the series. The fixed, pre-rendered camera angles were replaced with an over-the-shoulder perspective. The aiming was far more dynamic. You could now aim anywhere you wanted with precision. Shooting an enemy in the head or in the kneecap would cripple the enemy, allowing the player to perform a quick time event, which would see Leon performing a mighty roundhouse kick or suplex. Unlike early versions in the series, knives are actually useful. While enemies are down, the player can bring out their combat knife and finish enemies off. The knife can also be used to break open crate boxes and barrels throughout the game, which contain various items the player can use. The game's inventory has also been massively overhauled. Before, you were limited to 6 or so slots. Items you couldn't carry were placed in item boxes. This was a design choice to make the player think about what they needed to carry: weapons, health items, keys, puzzle items, and so on. An element of strategy was involved, but in Resident Evil 4, the player is given an attaché case which can be upgraded and expanded. The player has to manage all their items without an item box, moving them around like Tetris blocks. It almost becomes a mini-game in its own right. This unique inventory is something that many games at the time didn't have, and it was always satisfying to adjust the layout of the inventory and make it as efficient as possible. Non-key items could be disposed of or sold to a merchant, aptly referred to as the merchant. This mysterious man would appear at various points throughout the game and give the player an opportunity to upgrade weapons, purchase weapons, and sell items, such as excess ammunition or treasures found throughout the game. Such features were previously only found in RPGs, so such an inclusion was a big change for Resident Evil. In older titles, you simply found what you needed to survive in the environment, and were rewarded thoroughly exploring every crook and cranny of an area. The gameplay is a lot faster, with a greater emphasis on shooting and action as opposed to slow-paced environmental storytelling and puzzle solving. In fact, there are very few puzzles throughout the game, and those that you do encounter are as simple as puzzle sliders. Ammo conservation isn't nearly as important, as enemies drop ammo and you can find a nearly endless supply in the environment itself. In fact, I often ended up with so much ammo that I would often sell my surplus to the merchant for a few extra pesetas. The greater action focus does not necessarily mean that the game flies in the face of its survival horror roots. Although the game is clearly taking a different direction to previous titles, there are still enough scares here. You just need to look at the game in a different perspective. Instead of employing atmospheric horror, the game instead induces a sense of overwhelming panic and anxiety. Take the first 10 minutes of the game. After confronting your first enemy, the player is eventually thrust into an open village full of deranged villagers, all of whom run and chase at you with axes and pitchforks. The player, who has barely had enough time to become acquainted to the controls, is thrown into the deep end after just 1 or 2 tentative dips in the water. The player has no choice but to seek shelter in a house and barricade the doors and windows, a scene that is reminiscent of Romero's Night of the Living Dead. To make things even worse, a much more powerful enemy with a chainsaw is after you. If Dr. Salvador gets too close, he will swing his chainsaw at Leon's neck, an instant death that sees him being brutally decapitated. I'll admit that this entire sequence got my adrenaline pumping, and after losing my head, I panicked and switched off my console and left the room to calm down. This part of the game is incredibly effective for new players who have just started the game, new and old fans of the series alike. To say Resident Evil 4 starts on a high point is an understatement. As mentioned, the game employs panic instead of dread. Some may disagree, but having everything thrown at you so early on in the game is actually quite horrifying. However, to call Resident Evil 4 a horror game would be wrong. Although the game does have its creepy moments and panic-induced fights are a common occurrence, I found myself gradually acclimatizing to the action as the game progressed. By the time I got to the game's third and final act, the island area, I could easily dispatch enemies and welcomed a good fight. Large crowds of ganados no longer an issue. But it was at this point in the game, when I thought the game could no longer surprise me, that it gave me its biggest scare yet. The Regenerators, misspelled as regenerators in the English translation. Found in a decrepit lab with appropriately creepy music, Regenerators can, as their namesake attests, regrow their limbs. Only by shooting specific hidden parasites can the player kill this creature. The moment I was confronted with one of these lanky monstrosities, I yanked the power cable from my console and tried to calm myself down. Don't judge me too harshly. Before I played this game, I'd never played a horror game in my life. To me, someone who was completely inexperienced with horror, Resident Evil 4 was intense and at times downright disturbing. After subsequent playthroughs, and playing other, more atmospheric horror games, the impact faded. But I will never forget my first experience back in 2009. It was, quite frankly, unforgettable. The gameplay was, at the time, revolutionary. Most third-person games employed a free-rein camera that could be rotated 360 degrees. Resident Evil 4 went for something a little different. The camera was placed over the shoulder of the player, giving a limited POV, and it could only be turned left or right, like a person was turning their head. To look behind you, you would have to perform a quick turn, or manually turn around. This new camera perspective gave the player more freedom, while also limiting them to a certain extent. This perspective, combined with the gameplay, proved to be so effective that other games began to mimic it, such as Gears of War and Uncharted. This influence can still be seen today in most, if not all, third-person games. Resident Evil 4 literally reinvented how third-person games operated. It was also responsible for one of the first cover systems, and helped popularize quick-time events, for better or for worse. It's a safe bet that if you have played any third-person perspective game, action-themed or not, you owe the gameplay and perspective to Resident Evil 4. You could even go as far as to say that many games owe their very existence to Resident Evil 4, such as the likes of Dead Space. So, we've covered the gameplay basics and why they're so enjoyable and influential. But what about the game's story? Unfortunately, the story is where Resident Evil 4 falls short of its predecessors. Although the titles won't win awards for their often campy stories, they were sufficient and at least somewhat believable. The idea that a pharmaceutical company are secretly making biological weapons to sell to the military, only for one of their zombie-making viruses to infect people, due to a lab leak isn't that far from reality. However, the idea of a cult using a brain-controlling parasite and, in order to control the USA, kidnap the president's daughter is far from a down-to-earth plot, and in true action B-movie fashion, only one man can stop the cult.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
A Secret Service agent, Leon S. Kennedy, who makes a return appearance from Resident Evil 2. As you can tell by my summary, it isn't a surprise that Resident Evil 4 didn't win an Oscar for its insane story. But there is something endearing about how the game presents the story. It never takes itself too seriously, finding a perfect balance between the action horror scares and self-awareness, which is something I haven't seen replicated in future games.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
Say whatever you please.
The characters themselves are just as outlandish, but very likable and memorable. As mentioned, we have Leon returning from Resident Evil 2. In his first appearance, Leon was a rookie police officer who, on his first day on the job, got involved in the Raccoon City outbreak that saw the entire city infested with zombies. Between then and the events of Resident Evil 4, Leon has been trained by the United States government and become a trained agent and personal aide to the president. For some unknown reason. I guess it just sounded cool to the writers at the time. After all, it is a massive career jump.
Jeez, who are these guys? Did you say something?
Leon's training makes him a near superhuman, one-man army, as we can see in the gameplay. As such, he is sent to Europe alone in order to rescue the kidnapped president's daughter. The inclusion of Leon is both a blessing and a curse for the game. In one regard, he is an anchor for classic fans and a way to bridge the game to the rest of the series. But on the other hand, the vastly different tone and game style almost makes one think this should have been an entirely new video game series. Leon himself is almost unrecognizable to his prior self. Only the hairstyle remains of that once wet behind the ears rookie that nobody would listen to. Nonetheless, he is indisputably a badass in this game, albeit a little cheesy with his constant movie-style one-liners. Ada Wong makes another appearance as a shadowy femme fatale agent with mysterious purposes, and unlike Leon, she is a near-carbon copy of her Resident Evil 2 iteration. Her appearance throughout the game is explained in an unlockable campaign separate ways. Her involvement in the plot wasn't necessary, although she certainly fits the cheesy B-movie style of the game. For those who are hoping for a slow-paced, atmospheric horror experience compared to the earlier titles in the series, Resident Evil 4 will disappoint. But for literally anyone else, even horror fans, will enjoy the game. It is easy to look at Resident Evil 4 as a game desperate to shake away the roots of its origins, but it is also easy to be a little more positive and see it as a game that took a bold leap forward in order to establish new roots. Personally, this game changed my perspective on video games and horror games in general. Before I played Resident Evil 4, I had never played a single horror game in my life. I'd played games which were tangentially horror, such as sci-fi comedy Destroy All Humans. But Resident Evil 4 was definitely much gorier and adrenaline pumping. Resident Evil 4 had a perfect balance between action and horror that, to this day, the influence and effects are still felt throughout the gaming industry. This alone qualifies it to be one of the greatest games of all time.